Hey folks, we're going to meet a new poet and a new kind of poetry today. The gentleman in question is a poet by the name of John Donne. I'm going to go over his history here in a minute. You can see his picture down there. He has the pointiest beard in history. Probably put your eye out if you look at him wrong. But anyway, John Donne is sort of the guy who is the father figure of a new brand of poetry called metaphysical poetry, which probably actually owes its birth and genesis to Sir Philip Sidney and some of the things that he did in his sonnets. And I'll talk about that as we go through. We're going to look at two John Donne poems today. The first is called A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, and the second is Holy Sonnet 10. And they're from sort of two very, very different periods of John Donne's life. But before we jump to John Donne's history, let's jump to our Renaissance terms. Like I said earlier, we've left sonnets behind, and we're learning some new forms of English Renaissance poetry, and metaphysical poetry is the term of the day. So I want you to write this down, or at least learn it. Metaphysical poetry is poetry that focuses on abstract concepts and ideas, and relies heavily on figurative language and conceits. Conceits are a new term that we're going to learn today. But basically, when you think about something that's metaphysical, it has to do with abstractions and ideas. And metaphysical poets, whereas as Shakespeare is going to write a poem that, maybe defines true love, metaphysical poets would do the same thing, but they would ask the question, what is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Yeah, no, I can help it. But what is love? What does it mean? Or what is death? What does it mean to die? What does it mean to love? And they look at these abstract ideas, these abstract concepts. Maybe it's an emotion. Maybe it's a thing that happens that we have trouble articulating or understanding, and they'll try and put it into words. But they do this through the use of figurative language. There's going to be a lot of metaphors, a lot of similes, some paradoxes, some oxymorons, and all of those kinds of things together. But they have a new sort of figurative language in their arsenal, and that's the other term we got to learn today. So we're going to roll down to the figurative language here. And I just want to go over all of this real quick because we're going to see a lot of it. Metaphysical poets are full of figurative language. So the easiest figurative language is a simile, when you make a comparison using like or as, like this or as that. Whereas a metaphor, a little more complex, making a comparison, but you don't use like or as, you just sort of say is or compare something to something else. Both of those are pretty simple, and you've been seeing them since like ninth grade. So I want you to picture these as rungs on a ladder. Simile is the lowest rung. Metaphor is the next higher rung. And on the very top of that is this new term called conceit. It's sort of the third rung of that comparison ladder. And so a conceit is an extended metaphorical comparison, usually between an idea or emotion and a physical object or everyday experience. Let me go get an object and give you a conceit. So I picked a stapler up off my desk, right? If I was going to make a simile, I could say that love is like a stapler. If I was going to make a metaphor, I would say love is a stapler. Now, that would be the extent of the simile or the metaphor. In order to make a conceit, I have to extend the metaphor. I not only have to tell you that love is a stapler, but I have to explain how and why love is like a stapler. And I would look at all the various ways that love is like a stapler. So to make this a conceit, I would say love is like a stapler. It binds two people together. They're bound together by love, metaphorically, which is a staple. You can pull them apart, but it leaves an indelible mark that cannot be removed from the paper. Love is like a stapler, right? That would be a conceit. I'm going to look at the ways that love is like this stapler. But you don't have to pick something like love. You can pick, I don't know. We could argue that the American educational system is like a submarine, and then look at all the various ways that it's like a submarine. Maybe it's below sea level, or maybe you're trapped in a vessel with all the same people, and you can't get out until the voyage is over. And maybe the lower down your grade point average goes, the more the pressure increases until you either surface or you implode. You see what I'm saying? Like you can take this and you can roll with it, and you can look at different ideas or concepts and different objects, and look at all the ways that they work together. So normally I have my classes like create conceits at this point, but I'm just going to let that roll. Anyway, there's more figurative language here. Just a refresher, an oxymoron is when you have two contradictory words placed together, cold fire or bittersweet, for example. A paradox is an impossible or illogical statement, makes no literal sense, but it holds some figurative truth. So a lot of times it has to do with symbolism or something like that. And then hyperbole is a fancy word for exaggeration. We'll see that here. And personification is giving human traits, actions, or emotions to inanimate objects. An apostrophe is talking to something that cannot respond. And all of these things are going to be things that metaphysical poets do in their poems. And John Donne in particular does in his poetry. So those are the two new terms you need to know, conceit and metaphysical poetry. All the other terms are still in play. I'll attach this. To the module today. All right, so let's jump over and look at our friend John Donne. As I always tell you, we want to know something about the author before we read his poems, because all art is autobiography and we can't help but talk about ourselves. So John Donne was born in 1572 and died in 1631. He was an English poet, scholar, soldier, and secretary, born into a recusant family. That means he was Catholic. Now, this is important because, John Donne is living in a time when England is Protestant and fighting against the Catholics in Spain. Not in Spain, the Spanish Catholics. And so, there's a lot of tension between Protestants and Catholics, and it's illegal to be Catholic. And so you have to secretly be Catholic. And John Donne's family was Catholic, and he grew up that way. And it's sort of a tricky place for him to be. It limits his options, his positions in government. The other thing you need to know about John Donne is he was a very, very ambitious guy. It wanted to do things with his life. So let me roll you through his life story, because John Donne's story is really interesting. His life is sort of in two parts. It's almost like he had two different lives. And the first life, he was a young, ambitious, incredibly intelligent person. And in the second part, he was an older man who became one of the most famous sermon writers and preachers in English history. So, as a young man, John Donne grew up, he went to school, he would have graduated from college, but in order to graduate from college, he had to take an oath that essentially renounced his Catholicism and claimed that the King of England was, I guess, the head of the church, which, he believed the Pope was, and he refused to take this oath, so he didn't get his college diploma. But then he started to realize that without giving up his Catholicism and becoming Anglican, he couldn't advance at all in government. And like I said, he was an ambitious guy. He had all these things he wanted to do. So he started going about doing the right things in the right order. He joined the Navy and fought against the Spanish. And then he converted to Anglicanism. And then he started getting positions. He actually ended up becoming the secretary to probably the third most powerful guy in England at the time. I think his name's Sir Thomas Egerton. And so John Donne was his personal secretary, which, is sort of like the path that Edmund Spenser took, where he was secretary to the Lord Commander of Ireland, So anyway, Donne theoretically was moving up the ranks and could have expected to move even higher up the ranks, but his fortunes took a great change. It turns out that Thomas Egerton's niece, now I'm going to go have to look. 1 second. Let me double check and roll down. Yep, niece. I was right. So Sir Thomas Egerton's niece apparently came into the office one day, and John Donne looked at her, and she looked at him, and apparently it was love at first sight. They both fell madly in love with each other, and they decided that they were going to get married. Well, she was out of his social sphere. Not only that, but she was also significantly younger than he was, and so they were not going to get some consent to this match. But they married anyway. And so there's a question, John Donne was a very ambitious guy. Was he trying to marry up? Was he trying to secure a better position for himself and his children by marrying somebody who was so important and so famous, or was he really in love with her? And if it was the first, it failed miserably. It turns out that after they got married, the priest, the priest, the churchman who married them, was thrown in jail, and she was disowned. Her father was like, "You're not going to get a single penny from me," and so she lost her connections to her fortune. And John Donne was then blacklisted. He couldn't get any jobs. Egerton was like, "No, don't hire this man. He's a horrible human being," or whatever. And so John Donne went from a pretty secure position and an advantageous political marriage to nothing. He couldn't get full-time work. He couldn't support his family very well. He and she ended up living in a small cabin that one of his relatives let him live in. Very famously, he carved in the outside wall, "John Donne, Anne Donne, undone." But he did love her. He wrote, I don't know how many poems to her, addressed to her, and the one we're going to read first, "A Valediction Forbidding Mourning," is about that. And actually, it helps you, I think, to understand the poem, to understand this about his life, that they were sort of in disgrace, and he was doing everything he could to provide for a growing family. They had a lot of kids, a growing family that he couldn't provide for with the jobs that he had, and he had to travel all over the place and take all of these temporary jobs to make ends meet. And she, being so much younger than he was and disowned, was terrified that he would get sick or die or be murdered or something, and then she would have nothing. And she and all of her kids would starve. She would have gone from like this really high position of wealth to barely making it by. And so she was terrified that he would die. And actually, a lot of his poems are sort of to reassure her of himself and their relationship and the everlasting nature of love and stuff like that. And that's certainly what the poem that we're going to read is about. The irony of all of this, though, is that she's the one who died. She got sick and she died early, and that left Donne sort of alone. And this is where his career took a very, very different path. He ended up joining the church. Now, interestingly, remember, he refused to join the Anglican Church or make a vow in support of it when he was supposed to graduate from college. And, then maybe politically motivated, at least paid lip service to joining the church in his early years. But now he became a pastor, he became a minister, and he ended up writing a series of sonnets. We're going to read one of those today too, that were called holy sonnets, which are very, very different from other sonnets that came before. Other sonnets that came before were written about the love of a woman. John Donne starts writing holy sonnets. They're still about love, but they're about the love of God. And we're going to look at one of those. So, anyway, so his life was really in two different halves, and they're incredibly different from each other. Anyway, last thing I'm going to say about John Donne, because this video is already 13 minutes and I want to have time to get to the poem, is that, after he died, his poetry was not really famous. It was famous during his lifetime, but it sort of fell away and disappeared, and nobody really studied John Donne anymore. People thought the conceits were forced. They thought the poetry was difficult to understand, and it fell out of favor. And it wasn't until this guy named T.S. Eliot, really famous poet, in an interview in I want to say the 1940s, so he won like the Nobel Prize for literature, and somebody was interviewing him and said, "Hey, T.S. Eliot, who's your favorite poet?" And he said, "Oh, I love the work of John Donne." And then everybody who started reading John Donne again, they were like, wow, this guy's pretty good. And so he had a resurgence. And ever since then, he's been an influential poet for a lot of more modern poets moving forward. So we're looking at, I guess his poetry sort of had two halves to its lifespan as well. And I think that's interesting. All right, I'm going to shut up about John Donne. You can go to Wikipedia and you can look him up. He's got an interesting life, and you can learn a lot about him and help you understand the poetry. But we're going to look first at a metaphysical poem by John Donne from his younger years when he was married to Anne More, called A Valediction Forbidding Mourning. Now, the first thing that you should ever do with a poem is look at the title. Sonnets don't give you much because the title's just sonnet this or sonnet that. But this one has a clear title that Donne wrote, and the title's going to help you understand the poem. A valediction. All right, so that word valediction is an interesting word. you tend to think of valedictorian. A valedictorian is somebody who gives a farewell speech. I know this is interesting, and I know it's another sidetrack, but we tend to think of the valedictorian as having something to do with grades, but that's technically not part of the definition. The definition is just the person who gives the farewell speech, and we select it in high schools and colleges in America by grade point average, and so we have this false association of the term valedictorian with intelligence or something like that, and that's not the case. Valediction would be a farewell speech. It's not the valedictorian, it's the valediction itself. So this poem is a farewell speech, and then it says forbidding. That's obviously when something's forbidden you can't do it. So the farewell speech is telling someone not to, and then the last word is mourning with a OU. Mourning is sorrow or sadness. So it's a farewell speech telling people not to be sad, or telling someone not to be sad. Now, given the context of John Donne's life, this is written to his wife, and that she's afraid he's going to die before she does. And so he's writing this poem, and it's a farewell speech telling her not to be sad. So in this poem, he's actually going to sort of pretend that he's dying. Like, what happens if I die? And the poem is going to try and explain to his wife that she should not mourn, she should not be sad, and give the reasons. When we look at the structure of this poem, you can see that it's got 4-line groupings, 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are quatrains. When you look at the rhyme scheme of the quatrains, it's A, always A is the first one. B, because go doesn't rhyme with away. Say rhymes with away, so that's going to be an A again, and no rhymes with go, so that's going to be a B again. So we've got alternating rhymes, A, B, A, B. This one, obviously, noise doesn't rhyme with any of the things that came before. It's C, and then move is new, so it's D. Joys goes with noise, and love goes with move. Remember, love and prove rhymed. We got that vowel shift that we're dealing with. CD, CD. So it's going to go this way throughout the entire thing. We're not going to have to do the rhyme scheme. We'll just do a third quatrain just to make sure you understand. Fears is E. Meant is F. Spheres goes with fears, and innocent goes with meant. So we got EF, EF. So we've got a really stable alternating rhyme scheme that's going to go throughout this whole thing. I checked for meter. There is no specific meter. The first line is 11 syllables. Second, whisper to their souls to go is 8, and then I think you got like a 9, and then like a 8. So there's no clear specific meter throughout this thing. It's not like it's an iambic pentameter or anything, but we're going to look at it. I'm going to read you the whole thing, which is what I like to do, just so you get a sense of what the whole poem means, and then we're going to go through it stanza by stanza and break it down and understand what John Donne is saying here. This is a metaphysical poem, so keep your ears open for conceits. There's going to be a conceit in here. I told you about that term for a reason. It's not going to be a conceit about a stapler. It'll be something else. So a valediction forbidding mourning by John Donne. As virtuous men pass mildly away and whisper to their souls to go, while some of their sad friends do say, the breath goes now, and some say no. So let us melt and make no noise, no tear floods, nor sigh tempests move. 'Twere profanation of our joys to tell the laity our love. Moving of the earth brings harms and fears. Men reckon what it did and meant, but trepidation of the spheres, though greater far, is innocent. Dull sublunary lovers' love, whose soul is sense, cannot admit absence, because it does remove those things which elemented it. But we, by a love so much refined that ourselves know not what it is, interassured of the mind, care less eyes, lips, and hands to miss. Our two souls, therefore, which are one, though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion, like gold to airy thinness beat. If they be two, they are two, so as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul, the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but does if the other do. And though it in the center sit, yet when the other far does roam, it leans and hearkens after it and grows erect as that comes home. Such will you be to me, who must like the other foot obliquely run. Your firmness makes my circle just, and makes me end where I begun. Okay, so anybody catch a conceit in there? If you didn't, that's all right. We're going to go through the whole poem and make sure that you get it. So let's start at the beginning. A valediction forbidding mourning. So as virtuous men pass mildly away. Remember, I told you that we're going to be dealing sort of with Donne imagining his own death here. And so he's the virtuous man here. He's passing mildly away. So in this image, he's dying sort of in his sleep. And whisper to their souls to go. And so you get this idea of whisper. He's saying goodbye to his soul, but his breath is so faint. His like, I'm dying, that sort of a thing. While some of their sad friends do say the breath goes now, and some say no. Right, so then you've got this image of the people gathered around the deathbed of John Donne, and some of the friends are like, it was his last breath, and some are like, no, right? You've got this sort of deathbed image in the first quatrain. Then we get, I guess, some figurative language jumping right off. So let us melt and make no noise. No tear floods nor sigh tempests move. So looking at these first two lines of the second quatrain, he says, let us melt. Obviously, she's not going to melt, but when water melts, or when snow or ice melts, it trickles down in you. So it's the tears image, right? So let us melt. We're talking about crying and make no noise. So he tells her, go ahead and cry, but don't cry out. Just let the tears flow, but don't make any noise. He says, don't have tear floods. Now, this is hyperbole, or sigh tempests. In other words, he says, don't cry a river. Don't sigh a hurricane. Don't, wail and moan and make a scene when I die. Why? Well, the next two lines tell you. He says it was profanation of our joys. The root word of here is profane. Profanity, the same sort of root. It would be profanation of our joys to tell the laity. Laity is an interesting word too. Laity is like, so in the church, there's two groups of people. There's the group of people that are like the priests, and then there's the rest of everybody, which would be called the laity. And so what he does here in sort of another figurative way is he says that their love is like a religious sacrament. It's sacred, and her moaning and crying and making a scene would be profaning their love. It would make it cheaper. It would share it with everybody when it's supposed to be kept secret and just between them. They're a very private couple. And so he says, don't make a scene when I die. Don't show off your love. Our love is deep enough. You can keep it to yourself, like that sort of a thing. And then he goes on to a new quatrain. He says, moving of the earth. We're talking about earthquakes here. Moving of the earth brings harms and fears. Men reckon what it did and meant. So he suggests here that, like his death metaphorically, I guess, will be like an earthquake to her life, right? And this is true of anybody who loses a loved one. It's an earthquake to your life. It shakes the foundations of who you are, and that's metaphorically what he's saying. But more than that, he's also talking about regular earthquakes. He says, when an earthquake happens, there's harms and fears, and men reckon means guess or wonder what it did and meant. So, like we're talking about a time before science, right? And back before science, whenever there was something like an earthquake, people assumed that there was some sort of retribution caused by God. Right? Why did this thing happen? God, like, why did you do this? Right? And so the same thing is true when somebody dies. When you love somebody and they die, we tend to want to know why. We ask these questions. Why, God, did so-and-so have to go? Right? So in this case, he's like, my death will be an earthquake to your life. And your natural temptation is going to be to ask God why this thing happened. And so then he says, but trepidation of the spheres, though greater far, is innocent. He says, don't ask. These things just happen. There's no necessary reason why the earthquake happens. There's no reason why people have to die. God is innocent of making these things happen or not happen. Don't ask these questions. You're not going to find an answer, and it's not going to help you out, right? So again, the whole poem's directed to his wife, and he's like, look, if I die, don't make a scene. Don't ask why. It just happened. It's innocent. These things happen. Everybody dies, right? And then he moves on to a new quatrain. He says, dull sublunary. Sublunary is under the moon, like lunar. would be the moon, and sub is under. So he's talking about all lovers under the moon. Dull sublunary lovers lover whose soul is sense cannot admit absence. So most lovers under the moon cannot deal with long distance relationships. I don't know how many of you have been in a long distance relationship. It's pretty hard. I think, the older you get, the more likely it is that you'll run into having to be in a long distance relationship at some point. But he says they cannot admit absence because it does remove those things which elemented it. We're going to have to go on to the next quatrain to make sense of what he's saying here. But we, by a love so much refined that ourselves know not what it is, interassured of the mind, care less eyes, lips, and hands to miss. So when you look at these two quatrains together, what he's saying is most lovers can't handle a long distance relationship because their relationship is made up entirely of eyes, lips, and hands. In other words, it's a physical relationship, right? As soon as you take away the eyes, lips, and hands, the touching, the kissing, and the looking, there's nothing left of that relationship. It needs that physical element to be a successful relationship. He says, ours doesn't need that. We, by a love so much refined that ourselves know not what it is, interassured of the mind, meaning they're in so much love. Their love is so pure and so profound that it doesn't need a physical element. So he's essentially saying, like, look, we can handle a distance relationship. And what is the strongest, longest, most difficult distance relationship that anybody can be in? Well, it's when one of them dies. So he says, if I die, stop thinking about it as like a separation, like I'm gone forever. Think of it as a long distance relationship that's going to last the rest of your life. I'm still here. I'm still in love with you. We're still together. We just don't get to see each other until you also die, right? And so this interesting sort of, again, you see the metaphysical bit here? He's dealing with this complicated idea of like what happens when two people are in love and one of them dies. It's a love over. And he's like, no, it's just a long distance relationship. It's a big metaphor. So we're going to keep going down here. He says, our two souls, therefore, which are one. Now, that's an interesting idea. They've got two souls, two separate souls, but their two souls have become one soul. Though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion like gold to airy thinness beat. Now, there's a simile. He says, all right, think of it this way. Our two souls are gold. You have a little gold soul, and I have a little gold soul. And, of course, gold is a symbol of perfection. But gold is an element, right? And if we take your lump of gold and my lump of gold, and we get married, and we hammer these two lumps of gold together, they become one lump of gold. Can you separate one lump from the other? That's what happens to human souls when they get married. Actually, pause. Fun sort of story, Mr. Howard story, I guess. When I got married to my wife, we had a marriage ceremony, and I had my pastor, I flew him out to Ohio to do the ceremony from my church in Vermont. And he did not tell us he was going to do this, in fact. We got to the wedding ceremony, and we're getting ready for like the marriage vows. And he pulls out two little like leather bags, and he's like, all right, these bags are full of salt. He gives one to me, and he gives one to my wife. Well, she was my fiance at that time. We hadn't said I do yet. And so then he says, essentially, these bags represent your souls. If you want to get married, I'll ask you to pour those bags together. And so we both did, and we poured them into a center bag, and then he shook it up, and he said, all right, if you want to get unmarried, all you've got to do is take your salt back. And I was like, oh, crap, well, couldn't you have made it different colors or something? No, I didn't say that. I'm just joking. But it was a really powerful metaphor, and it stuck with me. And it's the same metaphor Donne's using here, except he uses gold instead of salt. But the idea is once you blend two souls together in marriage, they cannot be separated. They are not separate souls. They become one soul. And so when he says, though I must go, though I die, there's no breach. It's not like you can rip that soul out of the other one. We share one soul, and as long as one of us lives, both of us live. Right? He says we don't endure a breach. That soul isn't ripped apart, but expanded. And the simile is like gold to airy thinness. Gold is really cool because you can keep hammering. It's very malleable, and you can make it thinner and thinner and thinner. And in this metaphor or simile, he is suggesting that you can hammer gold so thin that it gets to the point of individual atoms where you can't see it anymore, but it's still there. And that's what happens when one person who dies, you know, and the other person in the relationship is still alive. They're still connected somehow. And so now we get the conceit. We've been waiting for the conceit, and here it is. Okay, I'm assuming you've used a math compass before. That's what our conceit is going to be about. Look at this. He says, if they be two, we're talking about his soul and her soul. If our two souls are two, they are two so as, there's as, it's sort of a simile, stiff twin compasses are two. Your soul, the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but does if the other do. And though it in the center sit, yet when the other far does roam, it leans and hearkens after it and grows erect as that comes home. So let's jump over here. There's our math compass, okay? This is what he's saying. He's saying, you know, these are our two souls. Here's your soul, the fixed foot, and here's my soul, the roaming, if you will, foot of a compass, right? And the compass is a symbol of their love. This is like my stapler analogy, but let's look at what he's saying here. He says, one, it seems like we have two souls, but we're really joined. We're really joined up here at the top by love. They call it the love compass, if you will. And he says, wherever I go in life, it's in orbit of you. You are the fixed foot. You are the center point of the circle of my life. That's pretty cool. The farther away I go from you, the lower down the center of the compass, the happiness that it has. The closer I get to you, the happier, the higher or more happy we are with each other. No matter where I go in life, I always have to return to you because we are linked. And if somehow death were to come between us, you know, it will exist here in the space between the two, but sort of like the wall of death, if you will, between the two of them, and they will be linked over and beyond it. And so, you know, if you were to say to me, you know, Valentine's Day was yesterday. If I were to write to my wife, and if I were to be like, our love is like a compass, she'd be like, what? This is not a metaphor that, you know, like is going to get you anywhere. But Donne pulls it off. Like, if I were to say love is like a math compass, nobody would buy that. But when you turn it into a conceit, and when you look at it as individual human souls and their bond and their link together, and the way that they orbit each other in perfect circles, and the happiness, depending on whether you're far away or close, and you know how this connects you even beyond death. It's a pretty powerful statement. So let's go back and let's look exactly. Now picture the compass in your mind as we read this. He says, if our souls are two, we're right up here. They are two, so as stiff twin compasses are two. Your soul, the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but does if the other do. They're linked no matter where they go. They're always facing each other. Think about it. You know, they're always leaning towards each other. They cannot ever be separated. The farther away he goes from her, the more they lean towards each other. And though in the center sit, she's the center of his world, yet when the other far does roam, it leans, there it is, just what I said, and hearkens after it, and grows erect as that comes home. Such will you be to me, who must, like the other foot, obliquely run. Your firmness makes my circle just, and makes me end where I begun. And so the whole thing ends with this conceit, this idea that love is like a math compass, and he orbits her, and she's the center of his world. And that will not change if he were to die. Remember, the whole thing is called a valediction forbidding mourning. This is his farewell poem to her if he is to die before she does. And it's telling her not to cry. It's telling her not to be sad. They're still together, even if he's dead. It's a powerful little poem, and a very, very romantic poem. One of the more romantic poems I've ever read. The irony, of course, of the poem itself is that it was his wife who died first, and Donne was left with this poem to comfort him. He never married again. So anyway, I'm gonna stop this video. It's at 34 minutes. I've got to do one more quick video today, so we're gonna jump into another John Donne poem in just a minute. Thanks for your time and attention.